Well, let me first of all say thank you to a lot of people. Chuck, especially for filling in at a literally just a couple hours notice, and praise team for doing the past couple of weeks. It's really a shame, but they sound so much better when I stay off the stage. So I don't know what we're going to do about that. And of course, to everybody else who kept us in our prayers, or your prayers, brought chicken noodle soup or barbecue or sent a card or all these things, we really appreciate it. I have been in a ton of fender benders through my life, but I got to tell you, none of them have ever hurt like this one. Wow, it's something else to be rear-ended. So my condolences to you if you've ever been in a bad car accident. Yeah, it's certainly no fun at all. If there's one place where we ought to be able to live together in peace, where we ought to be able to live together in unity, it has to be the church. Oh yeah, children's church is dismissed at this time. I missed that. Anybody up to age 12 wants to go and be part, it's in the first classroom. All right. Growing up, I think one of my guiding principles has always been to bring peace and unity to the church. Because growing up, I saw firsthand how much division happens in the name of Jesus. When I was 12 years old, I saw a congregation of uncaring people just basically destroy an elderly gentleman who was their pastor. And over the years, I have seen example after example of people who claimed to love Jesus, but they acted like the devil because they thought God was on their side. I'm ringing up here a little bit, Tom. In fact, in our language, we have a word. It's called bigot. A bigot in English means a person who is intolerant towards the other people who hold different opinions. And you say, where in the world did that word come from? It comes from the old German word, by God. Because people will do some incredibly mean things if they think God is asking them to do it. Over the years, this is what I've learned, and I hope it's not your experience, but it is mine, that the church can bring out the worst in people, or it can bring out the best. All right, we've been looking at some guiding principles. These are principles that have probably shaped my life more than maybe they have influenced your life. And today's guiding principle is a slogan. It's in essentials, unity, in opinions, liberty, in all things, love. And I would love to tell you that I came up with that, but I didn't. It's been around over 500 years now, and it forms the foundation of who we are as a congregation back in the early 1900s and the late 1800s, really, when we came together as a movement to restore the purity and the simplicity of the original church in the book of Acts to the church that we were part of at that time. And to show you that it really does work, I want to go back to probably what is the very first problem to ever have happened in the church. And here's the verse of scripture we're going to use. Some men came down from Judea. Now, that's a big-time Jewish place, okay? To Antioch. And that's a big-time non-Jewish place. And we're teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised, and if you don't know what that means, you should ask your mama after church. Let's just suffice it to say it's painful. According to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. Now, last year actually, we talked about this in detail as we were moving through a history of the book of Acts. So I'm just going to kind of summarize it a little bit and give you just a little bit of a background. The church started in the year 30 AD, 30 years after the birth of Jesus. But it started in Jerusalem. And it started among Jewish people only. For the first couple years, only Jewish people were in the church. Now, they were completely committed to their own Jewish heritage. They worshiped at the temple. They worshiped through Jewish festivals. They had very strict dietary laws that they followed. They had that circumcision, painful thing. They kept the Sabbath, and they obeyed the Old Testament law of Moses. And at first, these brand new Christians saw no reason to give up their old Jewish heritage. And so, even though they were now Christians, they still continued to do everything that was part of their old faith, Judaism. Now, the more these new Christians talked about Jesus, the more the Jewish leaders began to hate him. Persecutions happened, and they were, literally, it was violent. It was deadly. It was so bad, they were driven out of town. But as they left, people like Philip and his 4 adult daughters started preaching not just to Jews, but to non-Jews. And these Gentiles, now that, by the way, is a fancy church word of anybody who's not a Jew. If you're not a Jew, you are a Gentile. Or goyim is what you would hear today, maybe. So I noticed when we were in Israel on the trip, a lot of times people would secretly whisper that behind us as we walked around. So the words still, influence. There's Jews and non-Jews. Well, these non-Jews started becoming Christians. Wow. You would not believe how weird that could have been. I sometimes just think about it and laugh because Jerusalem is very devout, even today among the Orthodox. It's a very traditional kind of place. The Jewish faith is very proper, very reverent, and you get the idea. But now Antioch, where this new church is starting, biracial, Jew and Gentile in the same church. Antioch was a party town. Even in the days of Jesus, we're talking sex, we're talking drugs, we're talking alcohol. Anything went in Antioch. But some of those people, they listened to what these other people were saying about Jesus, and they became Christians. They gave their hearts to Jesus. Now here's the problem. One day some troublemakers from Jerusalem come up to Antioch. And I hate to say it, but these troublemakers were part of the church in Jerusalem. They were Jewish. And they came up and said, hey, we're really happy about you guys, but we want you to know something. Unless you get circumcised and start following the law of Moses completely, you can't be saved. In other words, you have to become a Jew, and then you can become a Christian. Man, do you see how arrogant that was? After a long time in the ministry, I've discovered something. A couple of things, really. Here's number one. Preachers love to make rules for other people. You ever notice that? We love to make a list of what church people have to do to be true believers. And I often remind you how I grew up in a very legalistic church. We were against TV, we were against movies, we were against playing cards, and we were really against dancing. That's why I can't dance, because I grew up in a legalistic church. And the Bible college that I went to was just as legalistic. No pool tables, no long hair, no beards. But you know what was worse of all of that experience? The Bible college taught me this is what this verse in the Bible means. It cannot mean anything else. This is what it must mean. And as I have been in the ministry longer, I've discovered that about half of the time they were wrong. And that's scary. So I probably don't need to tell you how we preachers like to make rules for you. You probably already know that. But let me tell you something you may not know. You guys love to make rules for each other. You guys love to judge each other for what you can do or what you can't do. Shucks, sometimes you guys even might like to make rules for us preachers. Preachers cannot mow their grass on Sundays. Believe it or not, I never heard that until I came to Galion. Honestly. And I said, okay, not a problem, but I'm going to mow at 10:30 at night then. My neighbor soon said, oh, it's okay, you mow all you want. Preachers must wear a suit and tie. Believe it or not, I know a preacher who actually, when he changes his oil in his car, wears a suit and tie. Wow. People just love to make other rules for people. A few years back, we had a great couple join our congregation for a little while. And the reason they joined here was they had just left another church in Galion who came to them after 2 or 3 weeks and said, if you want to keep attending here, we don't allow blue jeans. Whoa. They were a great couple as long as they stayed with us, and then they moved on. We just love making rules for other people. Now what's the problem with that? I think that's important because we're looking at that first part. In essentials, we have our unity. When we make rules for other people, we're playing God. God has a right to make the rules, okay? We got to follow them if we're going to follow God. But we don't have that same privilege. Did God say you couldn't wear blue jeans to church? I've never read that. Did God say you can't mow your yard on Sundays? I've never read that. Did God say you can't play pool in the bowling alley? I never read that. But yet we still make up these rules. And that was a problem there in Antioch. These Christians in Jerusalem, they were making a decision that God had not spoke to. And it was big, it was huge. Paul and Barnabas, the preachers at Antioch, they were madder than 2 wet cats in a bathtub. And so everybody goes to Jerusalem, and they go before the apostles and the elders of the Jerusalem church. And the apostles get it right. They ask one question: is this essential to salvation? Did God anywhere say Gentiles must become Jews before they can become Christians? I mean, yet they have obeyed Jesus, they've been baptized, they've prayed, they worship together. Was anything else required? And a whole bunch of the narrow-minded people down in Jerusalem said, oh yeah, they got to become just like us. They have to become Jewish. Now, if you think I'm preaching about ancient history today, just let me ask you some questions. Do you require new Christians to be anything more than a new Christian? Must they dress like you? Must they like the same kind of music as you like? Must they follow your style of worship? Do they have to believe everything just like you? Do they have to have the same opinion of the millennium, or do they have to have the same view of communion? How about the role of women in the church? Do they have to agree with you? You see, there's a lot of believers who still think that everybody else should act just like them. There are a lot of believers who believe their opinion is the only right opinion, and they cannot tolerate opinions that differ. But thank God the apostles asked the right question, and it's a question we need to wrestle with. we need to talk about this a lot longer than 20, 30 minutes. Is it essential to salvation? And they talked about it and prayed about it, and they said, no, hey, it's not. We're saved by grace just like they're saved by grace. Has nothing to do about becoming a Jew. And all the guys in Antioch stood up and said, amen, hallelujah, because there would be no painful surgeries on that day. Here's a principle, and again, we're not solving it, but I'm just bringing it up to you to think about it. Nothing should be required for membership in this church that God hasn't required for you to become a Christian. I want you to think about that. There's a lot of implications about that. Nothing should be required of you that God has not required for your own salvation. An old non-instrumental preacher said it like this: where God has a child, I have a brother or sister. You realize it's not my call. It's not my decision. If God is your father, then you're my brother or sister, and I don't have the right to kick you out of the family just because I disagree with you. So if we're ever going to have unity, you and I need to sit together, and we really need to talk about what is essential to our salvation. Well, that's the first part of that slogan, but I got to give you all of it today just to show you it works. The second part says, in our opinions, we have liberty. And there's a lot of things in the Bible that the Bible just doesn't talk about. There's not an answer from God about this or that or that, and we are left to using our own best judgment, our own maturity, and we have opinions. And in the matter of opinions, we have the right, all of us, to believe whatever we want to believe. We have the liberty. Now, it was hard at Antioch to pull this off. For Jews and Gentiles to worship together, but they did. Boy, it must have been hard, though. Suppose you're Jewish, and for 4,000 years you have been taught it is wrong to eat pork. You have never tasted pickled pig's feet. Oh, don't stick your nose up at that. They're awful good. You've never had pork barbecue. You've never had pork chops. You've never had sausage gravy and biscuits. How hard would it be for you to accept these heathen people who eat that stuff? But the apostles got together and said, salvation is by grace, not barbecue. By the way, eating pig's feet is not going to get you into heaven or keep you out of heaven. The point is, don't make a test of fellowship on matters that are not essential to salvation. Now, some of you today, right now, have never heard that word, test of fellowship. And I am so happy that you have never heard that phrase, because that's great. But it's a very old phrase. It's been in the Christian church and other churches for a long, long, long time. A test of fellowship says this: if you do this, or if you don't do this, then I will not acknowledge you as a Christian. In other words, it is a test of whether we're going to have fellowship. And there are some things that we have tests of fellowship over. The things that are essential, we have to agree on those to have unity. If God said it, common sense says we ought to do it. But in the matters of opinions, well, you get yours and I get mine. In fact, as I think back, every argument that I've ever seen in the church had something to do about an opinion. We all have personal biases, prejudices, funny notions we picked up somewhere. And maybe you don't want to admit it, but we all are different, and we're products of a background and how we were raised. But when the Bible doesn't speak about a subject directly, Well, your opinion is just good as mine. We may both be wrong. We may both be right in some degree. But just remember, opinions divide. But they can't divide us. Because that's the second part of that slogan. Well, we have our unity in the clear essentials of the church, and we need to study that really strong. In the matters of opinions, we do have liberty. Now, practically what am I saying? Well, if you are a Christian who has a conviction that you cannot drink coffee, don't drink coffee. But don't tell the rest of us we can't enjoy our morning cup of coffee. That's exactly what it means. Let me give you another quote as I give you a principle from each of these points. This comes from a very old preacher in Canton, Ohio, which at one time was the largest church in all of our movement. He says, in matters of opinion, we will agree to disagree without becoming disagreeable. Have you ever noticed how much disagreement comes from the building? You have to have Sunday night in this building or you can't go to heaven. Really? Who said that? You have to have Wednesday night. Really? Who said that? It is unscriptural to eat in this building. We talked about it a couple weeks ago. Really? You must pray, or you must worship, or you must take communion in this form fashion. Really? Who said that? You know, if you don't remember anything else from this little series we're in right now, remember this. The early church didn't have a building. They met in homes. They would meet outdoors. They would meet in temple courts. They saw fit not to build a building for about 250 years from Jesus' birth. They didn't need it. So anytime today that you make up a rule about what can happen in this building or what shouldn't happen in this building, you are already going someplace that the early church never went. They didn't use one. I'll even give you an example. I won't mention names since this is actually being recorded, put on the internet, but I grew up in Virginia. I served a church in Virginia, and there was a campus ministry on a nearby college. You would know it well. And it was struggling. They just couldn't get these college kids to show up. Everybody knows on Sunday morning, college kids sleep forever. They just sleep in because they party on Saturday night. And so at 11 o'clock, they would get maybe 4 or 5 kids come into the church service. And the preachers of that movement said, hey, I got an idea. Let's change the time of service till 3 o'clock. And so the preachers would get up and go out and play tennis in the morning. And then they would have church at 3 o'clock. The kids had already woke up, and attendance just shot up at this little campus ministry. But a few weeks later, it went back to almost nothing. You know what happened? All the area churches, except mine, now, we didn't. All the area churches says, look, if you don't go back to 11 a.m., we're not going to support you anymore because everybody knows you have to have church at 11 a.m. Right? Opinions divide. You just got to remember that. And where God hasn't spoken, you can have it, but don't divide the church. The last part says, in all things love. If you know the story, you'll remember that the apostles did ask the people in Antioch to do some things. They were just saying, you know, could you avoid blood? Could you avoid meat that's been offered to pagan things and stay away from bad people? And what they were simply trying to do was just to ease down the tension, because there's just natural tension between Jew and Gentile. Don't flaunt your liberty. Show a little love. And the last principle today is very simple. Love is a key that's going to unite us on the essentials. If you don't have love, you will never unite on the essentials of what it means to be a Christian. And it's love that helps us tolerate each other's opinions. Because you know and I know we can come up with some pretty wild opinions as believers. It would be so much easier for me to just make a list of 256 rules. I chose that number because that's the basis of computers. Everything in a computer works off of the number 256. And I'm doing you a favor because the Jewish religion, even today, has 613 commandments if you want to be an Orthodox Jew. But I'm going to cut that down to 256. And so when you come in here, I'm going to say, we are so glad you're visiting with us today. Here's our list of 256 rules that you have to follow for us to love you and take care of you and support you. But I can't do that, can I? It's so much harder to just love you. That's why loving each other is an essential. You don't get to go to heaven unless you get this one down. The Bible comes out and says, you can say you love God, but if you don't love your brother and sister, you're really just shooting the breeze. So let me just challenge you something as we draw it to close today. Christians, churches, I really think today especially they seem more occupied with these matters of opinions, matters of preference, matter of culture, tradition. They are more into that than they are into how could I just be a better follower of Jesus? How could I look more like Jesus? How could I act more like Jesus? How can I just nail that? And number two, I want to tell you this. The very moment you stop thinking about following Jesus, you're going to start falling out with each other. When you stop talking about Jesus, you start talking about each other. You can always see that. It's hard and fast rule. Oh man, I've seen a lot. I've seen police called right to the middle of a worship service. I've seen a rescue squad called right in the middle of the worship service. I have seen congregational meetings with deacons guarding it with guns and rifles. I have seen people ecstatic because they drove someone else away from church. And I've seen church people just fight like a bunch of cats over who owns the property. In short, I've seen some of the meanest, cruelest people masquerading as believers. But I also have to tell you, I have seen some of the best, kind-hearted, sweetest people in this universe in the church. And so I come back to where I began. Church can bring out the best in you, or church can bring out the worst in you. And so we have to be careful. In the first century, our story didn't have a happy ending. All these people who said they had to be Jews, they just said, well, I don't care what them apostles said. I still think they ought to have been Jews, or they have to become Jews. They actually started following Paul around from city to city. They bothered him so much that one day in the book of Galatians, he would write this. These people were trying to get you circumcised. Ouch. I wish they would go all the way and emasculate themselves. Bigger, ouch. Man's mad. Why is he so mad and why is he so angry? Because these people just totally forgot what it means to live by grace and love. So you just think about it today. We've just skirted the subject. The right decision of the apostles made the church grow exponentially. The people who couldn't understand the difference between an essential and a non-essential, who certainly didn't understand the meaning of love, they just died out. It has a lot of importance to who we are these days. Come on up, guys. Share with us a final song.